All right, it's 10 o'clock, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. This is a reminder that today's meeting is being recorded. And if you are okay being recorded, welcome. It's wonderful to see your faces. If you would prefer not to be recorded, just remember that you will not be visible or audible if you have yourself on mute and don't show your video camera. So in what way you'd like to participate is up to you. Today's training is titled, What Do We Mean by Trauma Informed? This is a training with the OSU Extension Service Outdoor School. And today's training is an overview about the brain and trauma-informed practice. This is a reminder that to participate in today's training, we encourage you to just monitor your background noise and use the mute button so that we can make sure the sound quality is good for everyone. If you are able to engage and give feedback and shout outs and appreciation, I would encourage you to use the chat button. One of the people that I follow likes to say, folks that are actively engaged are doing the learning. And because you can't talk during these types of engagements in a way and engage as if we were sitting together, using the chat is a really great button and great way for us to connect. So I would encourage you to go ahead and if you hear something you like, give feedback. If somebody says something you like, give them appreciation. If you actively use the chat, it's a great way to participate in today's training and create a more engaging learning experience. And again, if you're willing to turn on your webcam, it's wonderful to see you and I appreciate it as your trainer. And I just wanted to normalize the fact that many of us are working from home and we know that kids and partners and pets are at home too. And it's okay if you have some chaos in your background, we're used to it. So just wanted to welcome you and welcome the whole you to participate in today's training. So this is a reminder, if you are new to Zoom or if you use other types of web software programs for meetings, that you can mute and unmute yourself. You can turn on and off your video with the buttons that you see on the screen. If you click the participant button, you're able to rename yourself, and we're going to do that in a moment. And there are ways that you can share reactions by clicking on the reaction button. Okay, this is a reminder too that, or this is a acknowledgement that all education takes place on Indigenous homelands. And we have people that are joining us today from all around Oregon. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that there are historical and continuing relationships between the tribes and the bands who call Oregon their ancestral territory. And I'd like to begin by honoring those relationships between the Indigenous people and the land, plants, and animals on this place that we occupy and now call home. And in addition, I'd like to recognize the continued sovereignty of the 9 federally recognized tribes and the subsequent bands within those tribes. We've placed some resources if you'd like to do a little bit of learning about your own location or critical orientations course. So Christy, thank you for putting some additional resources in the chat. So I'd like to begin today with some additional acknowledgements and agreements. We encourage you to participate in whatever way you can, but please center inclusion, diversity, equity, and access in today's trainings and in your conversations. I ask you to bring humanity, authenticity, and humility to your conversations, and just acknowledge that folks who you connect with are in different places and have different circumstances, different lived experiences, and the perspective you bring is important and it's yours alone. And then finally, it's important in this training and in others to not attribute what you heard to a person unless you have explicit permission to do so. My name is Celeste Jansen, and I'm going to be your trainer today. I work at a consulting firm called Education Northwest. It's a nonprofit consulting firm, and my areas of focus are on the screen. Um, I am also a former camp director, and this work is really near and dear to my heart. So I'm pleased to be with you today just to share my passion and to hear your passion and to learn a little bit about this world of brain development and trauma-informed practice. If you're not familiar with Education Northwest, there are a variety of things that Education Northwest does to support schools and community organizations. And we offer a variety of different services where we engage with partners on problems of practice and try to create a future where all people, and especially young folks, can thrive. Today's training is the first training in a series of 3 on trauma and trauma-informed practice. We built these series to really build off of each other. Training 1 today is just going to be focused on the brain, the science behind the brain, what's going on with brain development, what is trauma, and what is trauma-informed practice. Training 2, which will be in 2 weeks and you're welcome to register, is going to be focused on personal practice. So that'll be around regulating oneself and working with students. That's really the application for everyone who's interested in trauma-informed practice. And finally, training 3 is about the organizational policies and practice that really need to happen at an organizational level to enable the trauma-informed practice that we talk about in training 2. Training 3 is probably more applicable for folks that are sitting in a policy position and are thinking about how they're training staff, how they're creating organizational policies. And at the same point, everyone is welcome, but it might be more meaningful to you if you sit in that role. So I am excited to engage with you on this journey and welcome you to sign up for training 2 or training 3 if you're interested in sharing and learning more. So as I mentioned on today's agenda, we're going to go through and we're going to start by talking about human growth and development. We're going to then focus on the growing brain, what happens in childhood with brain development. Then we're going to talk about trauma, and then we're going to talk about trauma-informed practice. Now, before we get started, I'd love to know who you are and what your role is. We're going to do this in a couple different ways. So first of all, I'd love if you could adjust your Zoom settings. So the way that you do that is you click on participant and you can hover over your name, and where it says more, I'm going to rename myself. I'm asking you to put your preferred name, your gender pronouns, and an affiliation or a community that you affiliate with. And that could be the place where you work, that could be the place where you live, that could be something about your personal identity. But if we could take a moment and go ahead and rename ourselves. All right, I'm seeing some name shift. All right, it's nice to see a lot of faces that I recognize. Good morning, everyone. Okay, thank you. Now, what I'd love to do is have everyone use the chat if you are not driving and if you can do this safely. But if you could go into the chat and just introduce yourself, you're welcome to share who you are and what you're excited about. But I'm also curious about understanding where you sit in relation to trauma-informed practice. If it's new to you, if you're interested and you're learning and growing on your own journey, or if you're at a place where this is a passion of yours and that you might be someone who can support others in their journey. So go ahead and please take a moment to share a little bit with all of us so that we can do our best to create a bit of a virtual community today. Great. I see a lot of learning and growing. Oh, great. I love that we've got folks that are willing to share their expertise today as well. Wonderful. Well, thank you all. If you haven't had a moment, please continue to share with us a little bit about who you are. I'm seeing that there's a variety of folks who are learning and growing, a few people that have, this is a new experience. And then I've seen a few folks who have also said that they're at a place where they are ready to grow and share with each other. Um, Finally, I also want to pause for a moment and just think about how you are going to center yourself as a learner. When I engage in a training, I try to always think about what am I doing to build my skills and what am I doing to build my practice. So today is really less about practice, and today is about creating a core set of foundational knowledge that then you can later apply to your practice. So if you are somebody who likes to draw and doodle, great. If you're someone who takes notes, great. These slides we will share with you. So if there's something you can't quite see on the screen, you can have access to the slides. We'll share a lot of links with you. But whatever it is that you need to do to make this information stick and to incorporate it with how you are already thinking, I'd encourage you to do so. After each one of our sections, I'm going to ask you what questions you have, and then I'm going to offer some form of a reflection. It might be a silent reflection, you might have a small group conversation, we might use chat, but some way to really reflect about what we're learning and thinking about how we can apply it in our own knowledge and incorporate into what we already know. So before we get started, just top of mind, what do you think about when you hear the term brain development? What's the first thing that comes to mind? I'd love for you to put it in the chat. And if for whatever reason you don't want to share publicly, you are always welcome to message me privately so that I can see that as well. And while I'm reading the slides and doing the training, I won't be monitoring the chat very closely, but Christy with OSU will be, so you're also welcome to message her directly. So what do you think about when you hear brain development? How the brain changes, aging and development, brain chemistry, connections, bottom to top, back to front, great. Throughout the lifetime, wonderful. Movement, integrating information over time, wonderful. How it changes, great. So today we're having wonderful. A lot of the concepts that we're going to be talking about today are concepts that you've already exposed to, that you might already be reading about and thinking about. Today we're going to be talking about trauma, and intentionally, I'm not centering trauma in our conversation. What I'm doing is really centering human growth and development, knowing that we are all on our own journeys of human growth and development, and that trauma and stress response are one aspect of how we grow and how our brains develop. But they're really, I think it's important when we're talking about trauma and talking about trauma response to put it within the greater context of human growth and development that is happening, certainly with young people and really with us as adults as well. So I wanted to provide first some just essential understandings to make sure that we're all on the same page and the way that we're approaching this topic. So these are my essential understandings about brain development and about trauma-informed practice. So there's so much to know about this work. I have friends that are therapists and we love to talk about this. Their life is dedicated to learning about trauma and to thinking about a healing response. So this is a 2-hour training. We will talk about what we can today, but really I think of today's training as an invitation to learn more. I also think it's really important from the outset and ongoing to just say the way the brain learns is cultural and it's social. And we understand that more and more, but many frameworks and research often centers a white perspective. And so what we know about brain development is evolving, but what we know about brain development, really we have to think about with a critical pedagogy and think about how it does or does not reflect the perspectives of youth and families, and make sure that we hold ourselves accountable when we're thinking about how we're framing and understanding brain development, and make sure that we're using an asset focused framework, which is why I'm also starting with this lens of human growth and development rather than centering trauma in our conversation. I'd also like to say the science is changing and it is fantastic. There are so many things right now that we know that we didn't know 5 years ago. So when you read a book on trauma informed practice, a lot of the emerging concepts you're not going to find in those books. And in a similar way, what I'm saying today, in 5 years ago, a lot of the things that we're believing today, we might have a more nuanced and deep understanding of. So this is an exciting time. I think about this as an interdisciplinary thing too, and that there is some different ways in which we can think about trauma and brain development. And it's important when we engage in this conversation to think about restorative justice or to think about social emotional development. There are many different lenses that really help us create this whole picture of trauma informed practice. So I'm inviting you today to bring your lived experience, bring who you are, bring your expertise. And what I'd like to do is not say this is trauma informed practice, but to really co construct trauma informed practice and to do so in a way that is really better than what we've seen in the past with some of the frameworks that really are about potentially, having more of a medical model of trauma and having more of an individual model of trauma that is very white centered. And we're going to talk more about this later throughout the training, but these are my essential understandings that I wanted to speak at the beginning just to get everybody on the same page. So let's get started by talking about social emotional development. There are a ton of different frameworks out there. And the reason why there are a ton of different frameworks is there's no one way to talk about social emotional development. There are lots of different ways that researchers have tried to classify all of the different aspects of humans and how we develop and different parts of our personalities. Some of the things that I really love, some of the frameworks that I appreciate, this is one from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. It's the ESA Lab, and they've got some really cool resources on their website. But what they do is try to think, well, some of how we grow are about skills and competencies that grow over time. And some of who we are is about our beliefs, and those also grow over time. And that there are some views maybe about our personalities as being very static and something that doesn't change much. And in actuality, our personalities and who we are very much are prone to change over time as we learn more, as we become different people, and as we experience different contexts. So you might have seen different SEL frameworks. Here's another one. CASEL has devoted all of their resources or much of their resources to what SEL looks like in schools. So often when you work with K-12 systems, as we all partner and do, CASEL is usually the go-to because of the resources, but in many ways, they're not the only way to talk about SEL. And they were also, I think, pretty late to understanding the way in which culture and equity needs to be integrated in SEL. And now they're having a lot of learned lessons. They've done some papers on something called transformative SEL. So if you're curious to learn more about SEL with a bit more of a racial justice lens, transformative SEL might be something that I'd invite you to learn a little bit more about. So going back to the Harvard way, at the Graduate School of Education to look at social emotional learning, how we grow over time builds, there are basic skills, and those skills as we get better at understanding, for example, basic social engagement. After we have some basic social engagement, it's easier to understand social cues. And as it's easier to understand social cues and label what's happening, it's easier for then us to step into more advanced skills like conflict resolution and pro-social cooperation. So how we grow over time really builds upon each other. And what's interesting here is that this is really still evolving. There is not a lot of clear understanding about what these building blocks are. And I think we're going to continue to know a lot more about how these building blocks build upon each other and how we grow over time and where there might be differences and how culture is really impactful about social emotional development over time. So I want to share one great example of how the science has changed. Um, the marshmallow experiment is one that a lot of folks know about, and you might have seen or heard about the marshmallow experiment before. There's some funny YouTube videos that you can look up where researchers basically gave a young person a marshmallow and then they said, hey, we're leaving the room. And when we come back, you're going to get a second marshmallow if you don't touch the one that we give you. So this is a test to see if young people can delay gratification. And there are these really cute, hilarious videos of young people just so tempted to eat that marshmallow and pick out the middle and sniff it and you name it, you know. The marshmallow experiment was replicated. I've seen it done in the United States. I've seen it done in Colombia. And this early years ago, we thought in understanding what happened through this experiment, that there was this thing called delaying gratification and that children who use strategies were better able to delay gratification. And so one way that we could support delaying gratification is helping to teach different strategies. So this is the way that we thought about social emotional development. And we really thought some kids don't have it, some kids don't. It's this skill. But what I'd like to share with you is an example of some of the ways in which this study has been critiqued. If you're food insecure, how you treat that marshmallow might be different. If you, depending on, you know, what your perspective on marshmallows are, right? It might be different. But here's something else that I think is really important. So this is the same study, same experiment that was done now in 2013. And what the researchers did is when they said, hey, I'm going to leave the room, they said, before I go, I'm going to give you some stickers. And sometimes they actually gave the stickers and sometimes they didn't. So they showed themselves to either be an adult who was reliable or an adult who was unreliable. And not surprisingly, when young people are assessing the situation and they say, hey, you're making promises to me and you're not holding up your promises, why would I think you're showing up with a marshmallow later? That's not something that actually makes sense. So young people were much more able to delay gratification when they read the cues and then they responded accordingly. Why I think this is really important is that sometimes we think about brain development as happening to individuals and somebody's got something or they don't. That is a really deficit based way to think about human development. And actually, what really happens for all of us is that we are a part of our environment. We read the cues in our environment. We are not static, you know, we are not people who are uninfluenced by things around us. Everyone is always thinking about themselves within a context. And what's playing out is very much like a puzzle. And so who we are might have a lot to do, not with just who our core is, but what's going on in the world around us. So I'd like to just pause for a moment and have you think about this. We don't need to share. This is more just for you to orient yourself to your own development. But when you think about yourself and your story, Where are you at? What are you working on? Where have you persevered? If you have a story of perseverance that is, potentially about overcoming stress, if it's potentially about achieving a goal or, holding your New Year's resolution straight through to the year, what was it that made you persevere? What strategies was it? What support did you have? Why were you dedicated? Why did it happen or not happen? I just want to pause and help create a space for you to just think about your own growth and development. All right. So we're now going to talk about the brain development in childhood. And before we do that, does anyone have a quick question that we need to address before we go on? Okay, great. We've got a lot to cover. So, all right. So I'd like to talk about the growing brain, and I'd like to do so with the context of a lot of this material is from Dan Siegel and his book, The Whole Brain Child. I'd love to see a show of hands on if you've read the book. So you're welcome to either raise your hand if you have, or use your reaction button and give me a hand up. So if this material you've seen before, I'd like to see it now. That will help me. I see one thumb, two thumbs. Great. Okay, great. That's helpful. Okay, so I like to talk about brain development for a few reasons. I think sometimes folks, and I'm hearing a little bit of background noise from someone. I think sometimes when people are new to trauma-informed practice, they have a tendency to think about every emotional reaction as a trauma response. And this is really to ground us in, there's a lot that's happening in the brain during childhood. When you think about everything that occurs for a 5-year-old to become an 18-year-old, or indeed to become a 35-year-old, there's a lot of different things that are playing out. So this book is an amazing resource if you're curious about learning more about how to parent or how to teach or how to support young people with a lens of brain development in mind. Dan Siegel also wrote another great book called Parenting from the Inside Out that has a similar lens. So there are 5 different types of brain development that are happening during childhood, or 5 different ways that he talks about the brain really growing. The first is the integration of the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. So young children are very much right brain centered. And when you hear the Y phase kick in, that's when they're starting to have their right brain and their left brain engage more. So throughout childhood, there are a lot of times where you might see an emotional response that doesn't quite make sense to our adult logical brains. And what you might see potentially is a face quiver, or you might see some nuances that a young person is really trying to specifically say, like, I didn't punch him, I hit him. Where like there is this difference of someone who is trying to navigate an emotional reaction with a logical reaction. And it doesn't always necessarily line up right at the beginning. There is a misnomer that we are right-brained or we're left-brained, and that's really not what we know from science. If we were right-brained or left-brained, we would be an emotional flood or an emotional desert. But the integration that happens during childhood really connects the left brain and the right brain so that we have more brain development that is whole brained during childhood. So I'm not going to focus a lot on practice, but I thought it might be helpful a couple times through these slides to share just strategies that help create a whole brain, that help with the brain development, to help better understand what it is that is going on in the brain during these key moments. Um, so this, for example, is a strategy about connecting the left brain and the right brain that is really helpful. When you see something that might be an emotional response that doesn't necessarily make sense, instead of jumping to a command and demand, which is a very normal way that adults treat children, or instead of questioning what is it that they're doing, I'm going to, using my logical brain or defending yourself, first move into your right brain. Think about your nonverbal language, think about your tone, think about your body language, think about ways in which you're really connecting with a young person where they might be swimming in their right brain and have a harder time putting logic and reason behind the words that they're using. So making sure that when you communicate, you're not expecting a left brain response is one way that you can really connect with them and then redirect to talk more about what's going on. In addition, Dan Siegel recommends helping to name emotions is a really nice way to then tame those emotions. And the way that you can name emotions are around telling a story. It could be drawing a picture. It could be lots of things that are really right brain oriented and general, and that helping to a young person connect with that right brain and the left brain then could be around, centering that right brain experience and then bridging and making connections to the left brain, creating a story, and then telling the story or helping a young person construct a story around it. He urges us, don't try to do this if you're in a bad mood, because it will be a bad experience and that's not what we're looking to do. A second way that a brain develops during childhood is the integration of the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain, which we're going to talk a lot more about because this is the stress response or this is the trauma response. So in brain development, we have this lower part of our brain that is always on. It is always scanning. It is always looking for cues. We're not thinking about it. It is just happening. It is really around where we're noticing things that are subconscious and that are deep and that are just the way in which our brain keeps us safe and has always. So this is in our brainstem, a lot of that that scanning and assessing what's going on out there. And we do it, of course, without thinking about it. As our brain is scanning and looking around, the next part of our brain that information comes to is the limbic region or the mid part of our brain. That scientists call the emotional brain, and that's what records experiences. And there's a couple different components of the brain. But what I want to point out in this section, the important part is the amygdala. Sometimes people call it the screaming almond. It's about the size of your thumb. It's just a tiny part of your brain, but it's really something that acts like a traffic controller. So the amygdala sees things that are happening and says, is that safe? Am I okay? If so, I will send that information up to the top of the brain, to the thinking part of the brain. Or am I not safe? And therefore, I need to react with the fight, flight, or freeze. So whether or not someone is feeling safe helps is because of the amygdala, and because whether or not the amygdala is saying this is a safe place for you to engage in, or this is not a safe place. Let's see. Finally, I mentioned the kind of upper part of the brain, or the neocortex region. This is the top of the brain that we see that's squishy. when we see an image of the brain, it's really where there is some more complex thinking. This is where when we learn and we're in school, our neocortex region is engaged. It's creating connections. This is where there's some abstract thinking. This is where we organize and self-regulate. Um, and so this is a really important part for us as educators. When we're connecting and working with young people, we're looking for those young people to actually be building connections within that part of their brain, the neocortex region. Dan Siegel has a really nice way of explaining all of this using his hand. And so if you will look at me for a moment, the way that he says this is there is the lower part of our hand is the brainstem. The middle part of our hand is that middle area. And then the prefrontal cortex is our thinking brain. And there's my little amygdala there that is kind of like the almond. So what happens is when people are scanning and looking around, information comes to the amygdala, and the amygdala either says it's safe, I'm going to send information up to the top part of the brain, and I'm thinking, I'm prepared, I can engage with you, or it's not safe. And in that case, the prefrontal cortex is not engaged. My son learns this in Portland Public. So for those of you that are working in Portland Public Schools, you might have kids who know about the brain in the palm of your hand. My son said, "Mom, I hate it when I do this." And I was lucky that I knew what he was talking about. Dan Siegel calls it flipping your lid. When you get to a place where you have a dysregulation or a trauma response, where your prefrontal cortex is not engaged and the amygdala is in control, and you're going through that fight or flight or freeze situation. So if you're interested in learning more about that, if you look up brain states, you can find some nice information. And Portland Public uses some curriculum to where they color code it. But again, a really nice resource if you're going to be partnering with schools that use that type of information for you to understand how they're talking to their young people about brain development and about emotional regulation. So if we pause and just for a moment think about what you just heard, what is it that determines if the amygdala sends information up or sends information down? What is it that makes the amygdala decide if it's safe or not safe? I'm going to pause for a second. All right. Does anybody have a comment about what it is? I'm seeing there's a couple questions in the chat. We'll get to them in just a second. Prior experiences. Exactly, Carrie. Yeah. What is going to tell my amygdala that something's safe or not safe is about me. And what Carrie, your experiences, or Brianna, your experience, or Steve, your experience, it's about what has happened to you in the past. So this again gets at how personal brain development is and about how much there is this really important contextual relationship about a young person and what experiences they've had in the past that really are key to brain development. I'm going to keep going on because there's a lot to cover. But after I go through the different types of brain development, we'll go back and answer some questions. So I mentioned this a little bit about brain development. I mean, a little bit before about learning, but why this really matters for learning is that the learning is nearly impossible when a young person is in a stressed out place. So if stress is detected in the environment and the nervous system is telling that amygdala it is not socially, emotionally, or intellectually safe, then there are stress signals happening through the body, a stress hormone is produced, and that's not an environment for learning. So a strategy, one of the many strategies that we're going to talk about, and that again, our next training is really focused on, is thinking about when a young person is at that place, they're not at a place where their thinking brain is able to say, this is why I acted this way, and here's how I should respond. So as an adult, when we are working with a young person who that term flipped their lid is the way that Dan Siegel says the brain is not, the upper portion of the brain is disengaged. It's not connected. It's the amygdala is not sending information up. So if you are thinking about working with a young person and you see some of that, ask yourself, which part of the brain do I want to appeal to? And instead of use that command and demand strategy, which can definitely provoke someone running, a lot of different experiences, someone fighting, work to get upstairs, meaning acknowledge emotion, acknowledge where a young person's at, just settle in sort of a different way than flipping to logic. Later, you can say, let's come up with a solution that will work for us. So we'll talk again a lot more about practice later, but I thought it would be helpful to just give a little nuance here to share a little bit about this type of strategy to help understand that upstairs brain, downstairs brain interaction. Another really important thing that I like to say, and I'll probably say in all 3 webinars, is that exercise is like a sponge. And when you have stress hormones that are pinging around in a brain, one really amazing way to get rid of them is to have a young person move. So Dan Siegel coined the term, or used the term, move it or lose it. When you see somebody and they're really stressed, go for a walk, go outside, do something where you're really able to incorporate movement, because just think about a sponge that's sweeping out some of the stress hormones that otherwise are going to keep pinging around in their brain. It's also why many of us, when we're thinking about ourselves and our own practice and our own journey, it's really wonderful to incorporate movement in our own stress response cycle. Again, one of the ways in which we are not looking at this in isolation of just saying, how do we think about young people, but how are you thinking about yourselves? How do you incorporate movement in your own world when you are experiencing a stress response? Okay, so another type of brain development that is also occurring during childhood is the integration of memory. So this happens specifically with the hippocampus. It's the part of the brain that really guides memory and that is the memory system. And something to share, there are a lot of ways that we think about memory that are not really accurate. So one of them is that the memory is like a file cabinet. You think about something, you pull it out, you look at it, you say like, oh, that's what my memory is, and then you put it away. Or that memory is like a photocopy machine. I know exactly what happened. I was there, I saw it happen, I recorded that. Both of those are memory myths, and that's not actually the way that our human brain works. So instead, what's actually happening is that memory is about association. Memory is about how you piece together different experiences, and that there is the saying, neurons that fire together wire together. That might mean that an important part of your memory has to do with a sense of smell or a body sensation. It might be that the way that you think about memory really a lot of us think about it in terms of just the things that we're thinking and not our whole body sensations that are a part of memory. And then finally, the very act of recalling a memory changes it. So the memories that you think you know, the things that you're sure happened a certain way that you think about often, are probably the most distorted. And memories that you believe are the most accurate, and the memories that you don't think about quite as often might be ones that actually are more similar to the way something actually played out. It's really interesting when you start to think about brain development and learn that so much of the way that we think we know what we know is not actually accurate. But within childhood, we're working on creating more synapses with that hippocampus, and we're trying to figure out more about what's going on and working on memory. And two different ways that that happens are implicit memories and explicit memories. So, my friend who is a therapist said, all of when we're children and before we're verbal, there's still a lot that's going on in the world. And maybe one day your parents got into a huge argument while your mom was cooking bacon. And so it might be for the rest of your life, when you smell bacon, it doesn't really feel good to you and you don't really like the reason. Those implicit memories are very important memories, and we each have them, but we might not know what they are. We don't necessarily have an explicit memory that says, this happened to me and this is what's going on with my brain. And this is why I think that. One way that I've experienced this is I one year had a terrible, stressful job for 6 months, and it was truly, truly something that stressed me out. I noticed later that when I was driving down the road near that place of work, that my body started to react where I had more tension. I felt my heartbeat, I felt some adrenaline go through me. It wasn't even something that I was explicitly thinking about. It was my body's implicit memory to driving to work that I was experiencing. Um, Having the implicit memories turn explicit are ways that we can engage with memory and help transform what's going on in the brain. I realized what was happening. I made an implicit memory explicit, and now I was able to deal with the stress response, and I can drive past that place and not feel stressed. But it's just important for us to acknowledge that there are things that happen to us and to young people and to all other people that don't make sense. And that might be something that means that's about an implicit memory. My friend who's a therapist said, all behavior makes sense. We don't necessarily know why, and that's okay, but just remember that all behavior makes sense. Another thing that happens in brain development with a young person is that we begin to incorporate the many different parts of oneself. So, if we think about ourselves as being not just Celeste, who I think about myself in one way, but I have different sensations that are happening at the same time that I'm seeing images, at the same time that I'm feeling feelings, at the same time that I'm thinking thoughts. One of the things that happens during brain development as we learn to incorporate the many different parts of ourselves so that I can incorporate my sensations and the images and feelings and thoughts into one holistic picture of how I'm experiencing the world. So, again, just a really interesting way that the brain is developing during childhood. And a strategy for helping a young person think about themselves and as incorporating the whole is to spend a little bit of time focusing on the different aspects of oneself, to see and acknowledge each of them individually and think about how they come together. Another way that is a really great strategy to think about incorporating the many different ways in which we are growing um, are to help a young people understand that emotions are like the weather. That when you're sad, when you're hurt, when you're scared, doesn't mean that that's who you are. It means what you're experiencing at the moment. And that when you're in a really troubling or challenging time, that you can let the clouds of emotion roll by. You can experience them, you can marinate in them, but they're not what define you as a person. Finally, the last, oh no, yeah, the last type of brain development that is happening during childhood is the integration of the self with others. And that, we are all wired to be in community. We are social creatures, and we know this so much now viscerally because of our experience over the last year during the COVID-19 response. But we are all meant to be in a group, and we are all wired to have our neurons mirror each other's and to work as a part of a community. So our brains are truly wired for we, and a part of the brain development that is happening during childhood is really that growth of the me we connection, of understanding oneself in relationship to others, and and growing that deep connection. So some of the things that I'd like to talk about are incorporated. The work that we've talked about so far, those last few slides, were all in Dan Siegel's book. So earlier I talked about how the science is changing, and I want to pause for a second and talk about belonging and talk about a cognitive tax. There's some really important work that is being led by like game-changing researchers that are really helping us to understand what's happening in a brain and what's happening during times when a young person might feel excluded. And I just want to orient you all to read and to learn about Dr. Gray and follow some of his research on belonging. He's also got some great videos. And if you look at Mindset Scholars, there's one that I just think is transformational. Dr. Gray is the author of a document that's called Black and Belonging at School. And what he talks about in that article is that all people are always scanning the environment, looking for cues to say, is it safe? Do I belong? Is it safe? Do I belong? Is it safe? Do I belong? And in doing so, if you, for some reason, are in an environment that doesn't match your identity, your brain is more stressed thinking about, do I belong? Do I belong? Do I belong? Is this safe for me? Is this a safe place for me to engage? Am I going to be respected? Am I going to be valued? So the way that we're thinking about brain development, he's talking about it now as a cognitive tax, that when we are having young Black and Brown students engage in systems where they don't feel like they belong, their brains are having to do this cognitive tax of, do I belong? Do I belong? That makes them less able to just immediately engage. We have a responsibility to make sure that when a young person is viewing the environment and thinking, do I belong? Do I belong? That their brains aren't stressing them out saying, I don't know if you belong here. I don't know if this is a safe place for you. So when he talks about sense of belonging, he says, people often say an interpersonal view of belonging is, building relationships, and that's what we need to do in order to lessen that cognitive tax and create a place where all students truly are able to succeed. But he also has a deeper version of belonging. And he said, there are interpersonal ways that we can think about belonging. There are also instructional ways that we think about belonging, and there are institutional ways that we should be thinking about belonging. So again, something that I just think is truly transformational and is really, really important. So if you haven't followed his research, I would encourage you to do so. He also just said a lot of really powerful things, like a lot of educators see somebody who is participating in an environment and thinks, oh yeah, those kids think they belong, and misrepresenting what you see on the outside, where if you don't see somebody actively engaging or maybe actively saying this isn't right, that you think all students belong. But to feel belonged is to feel a sense of belonging is not just about participating in a way that looks like you're following the rules. To to feel a sense of belonging is to feel valued and to feel respected. So does a young person in your environment feel valued? Do they feel respected? That is a sense of belonging. So I want to pause and have you all have an opportunity to just reflect on what you heard. Before we do this, before we get into small groups, I'd like to just ask, what questions do you have? I know that there are some in the chat, and if you have a question that you haven't put in the chat, please feel free to do so now.
Celeste, would you like me to read out some of the questions?
I'll go through the ones that I can see, but if you have any that are more that you know about that just went to you, please let me know.
Okay, I think the first one shows up at 10:31 a.m. if you're following the timestamps in the chat.
Okay, great. Yeah, Misha, the whole left brain, right brain thing in some ways is debunked in that we're not left brain people or right brain people. We are both. And yeah, there is more nuance to the left brain, right brain brain development than I think we see in popular science. It's not that it's not true, but it's that they're about different parts of our brain that are integrating for a whole. So yes, you know, there is a lot about the kind of left brain, right brain type of brain development or conversation that has been debunked. Maggie, the flipping the lid is about that having a dysregulated stress response where someone might be not able to engage in kind of logical thinking because the amygdala is saying it's not safe here, and the young person is acting out in a way that we would say is more about a stress response system. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And Daniel, you know, I don't know a lot about ADHD or ADD and how brain development may or may not be different. Your pondering is a possibility. I guess I'm curious if maybe anybody else knows anything about ADD or ADHD and if that has to do with a particular type of brain development. I'm going to pause for a second. We can crowdsource your question and find out if there's a little bit more. Okay, great. So we're about halfway through the training. I'd like to take a quick bio break and just give you all a moment to stretch your legs and to think. I know you've been sitting in a role that has been passive and listening to me talk. Why don't we take a break for about 5 minutes? We're going to come back at 11:05. And then we're going to have small group conversations. And in those small group conversations, there's going to be about 3 people in the room and just a space for reflection questions. I have some samples up. So you're welcome to talk about any of these questions, and you're welcome to also just process in whatever way feels right. for you to think about the information we just covered and how you see brain development in action in the young people you serve, how understanding brain development might make you think differently about your work or your practice, or something that you want to learn more about. So, and if you step away and there's more questions that you want to address, feel free to type them in the chat. I saw one came in now. Let's go ahead and take a bio break now. And because it's 11:02, we'll come back in 5 minutes. So I will see you all at 11:07. Thanks, everyone. All right, everyone. I think we have about a minute more. So if you're walking through your kitchen now and you hear my voice, if you could slowly orient yourself back towards your computer or your device. Christy, thank you for putting the reflection questions in the chat. Yes, as you all go into the breakout rooms, you will have access to those. Again, those are ones that you're welcome to use, and you're welcome to also just share in whatever way you'd like to. We will go ahead and have you in your breakout sessions or breakout groups for about 6 minutes. So on average, if there's 3 of you, you have the opportunity to talk for about 2 minutes each. And if you finish early and don't feel like you have much to say, or if there's no one in the breakout room with you, you're welcome to leave the breakout room and to come back into the whole group where I will be. So, Christy, will you go ahead and launch the breakout rooms?
Yes, it should send you there automatically, and it will bring you back to this main room automatically unless you choose to come back earlier. So I'm going to send you off.
All right, welcome back. If you have the ability to just share in the chat anything that really resonated with you, I'd love to get a sense of what your conversations were like. So please share if you can do so. And if there are any questions that you all had, I'd love to see those as well. Yeah, the need for empathy and compassion. Yep. And yes, that was fast. I know 6 minutes goes fast. Yeah, Maggie mentioned the broad range of development at the middle school age group. You know, a lot of people talk about the amount of brain growth that happens in early childhood as just something that, you know, is well known. It's a significant amount. But the next phase in life that has the next largest amount of brain growth is that middle school age group. It's the mid-adolescence. There's a really nice brief that I think Rich Lerner did about just the power of thinking about middle school groups and about focusing on mid-adolescence, because it is such a time of extreme brain development, and that's a time when young people are learning a lot of things about themselves and orienting themselves to others in a new way. Let's see. Trauma-informed care in a CDL setting can pose additional challenges and opportunities. Yes, absolutely. We should talk about that, Catherine, in our next training. How we can all be more empathetic mentors and have better tools. Absolutely, I love that. Understanding brain development can help you be a more effective educator. I've had a great conversation with some folks that work over at Gladstone School District, and they said, Celeste, I think that maybe school districts need to hire more folks that are experts in development. And I really believe that. I think it's really important. The SOLD Alliance, by the way, is doing really, really, really cool work on human development and brain development. And then thinking about how it is that schools should actually transform in order to better support brain development. If you're interested in that work, it's so cool. And it's SOLD is the Science of Learning Development, or Science of Learning and Development. And you can find some interesting papers. Yeah, Dan mentioned too collectivist culture and individualistic culture, assumptions about belonging and brain development that I appreciate. I wish I had been in that conversation to participate and just listen and learn. Thank you. Trust, feeling safe, cultural difference of learners. Um, Great. Thank you for sharing these. These sound like wonderful concepts. Yeah, Kai, I was thinking of putting together a resource list. We'll share it afterwards, but of some of these like tips and some of these conversations. Um, One of the women on my team who is just this amazing advocate and woman of color that really tries to unapologetically support the young people that she works with and do so with a lens of culture has oriented me to Hofstede and the Hofstede research that happens in like international marketing to better understand the 6 different ways in which different cultures have social emotional skills that are really cultural. And that has been a really powerful tool that we like to talk about and help us kind of on our growth edge think about what does this mean in youth development. So if you haven't seen the Hofstede, I think it's Hofstede. I might have that wrong. What brain development is happening at specific ages. So that's important to note that we try to not say this is what happens at a particular age. It's really at a developmental stage. So young people might be experiencing different things at different ages. And it's not linear, it's much more about association. Once you learn something, you might unlearn it, you might learn it in a different way. Um, Great. Okay. Thank you for sharing these. I'm going to look at them after today's training. A couple of comments that some folks made also, um, empathy and the way in which we orient towards empathy is something that is a part of social emotional development. And I've heard some really interesting work that researchers have done too on helping young people orient towards empathy. But what they found is that some young people didn't read faces in the same way. So they first talked about looking at faces and helped young people understand this is a face that means I'm feeling anger. This is a face that means I'm feeling um, surprise. Um, that that was just really intriguing. I heard about it years ago, but it makes me ponder and think about just brain development and when are we at a place where young people lead with empathy and when are we not and how do we teach empathy. So thank you for bringing up. I have some wonderings that I think about and explore when I think about young people and empathy and how to help create a culture of care between peers as well. And then there was a question about belonging. Someone had said, what is it, or what's our response as educators to really help create structures where students feel belong, or if students feel like they belong, and how can we do so? To me, this is the most important place where schools and youth programs have incredible opportunities to really create, opportunity structures for sense of belonging. And how we do that create is a problem of practice in our field. And the better we get and the better we're able to do that, is really creates a really transformative learning experience. I wish school improvement was totally focused on sense of belonging. If we have places where young people feel like they belong, um, young people are curious and people want to engage. So that's a passion of mine, and there's so many cool new resources. Oh, which by the way, I mentioned Dr. Gray and the Mindset Scholars work. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about it, again, it's incredibly powerful. And I hope everybody who's on this training will watch this video. They posted it and shared it on YouTube, but it talks about opportunity. It talks about belonging. There's a few different people that participate. There's a nonprofit in Oakland that is doing incredible work called Kingmakers. And they've just said, like, we are not going to talk about changing kids. If fish are swimming in a toxic river, why do you treat the fish? No, you treat the river. Let's talk about changing our system so that we can have healthy systems. Okay, so let's go back to, we only have 40 minutes or so, and we have a lot more to cover. So we've just talked about brain development, and we've talked about social emotional learning. So we're oriented in thinking about our growth and development as humans. So now let's talk a little bit about trauma. So this graphic is from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard. And it outlines the difference between positive stress response, which we all experience at times and which can help like kick our butt into gear when we have a deadline and we need to get something going, between tolerable stress, where we might be experiencing some stress, but we also have some wonderful assets that might buffer and support us in navigating what's going on, and toxic stress, which is much more prolonged, which might have some different risk factors, and where there might not be presence and protective relationships. Now, I want to pause and say this is a very basic way to think about stress, and that there are different ways that we can think about stress and trauma, and there are different types of trauma responses, like a complex trauma response. With that being said, our job are not clinicians, and so rather than get into more technical terms of trauma, I think it's important to recognize some very basic elements about stress and tolerable stress and toxic stress. And then I want to broaden our perspective of toxic stress, but I want to do it in a different way than diving into what's a clinical way to look at it. And I want to think about it more with a bit of a racial equity view. So to start off, SAMHSA has a concept of stress that, or of toxic stress, that is really important and is one of those essential things that's good to know when you're learning about trauma-informed practice. So they say a concept of trauma is about an event, and that event is experienced by a person. But the nuance here is that how you experience it has to do with who you are and what your cultural beliefs are and how that played out and what supportive relationships you have. So it's not just about an event, it's also about an experience of the event that is really individual. And, oh, I have the wrong word bolded on the last one. The last E is effects. So not only is there an event that's experienced, but the way that those two play out is that there is lasting physical and mental effects from the trauma. This is the way that SAMHSA thinks about trauma. And this is the way I would say a lot of mental health practitioners think about trauma. And this is the way many books are oriented to talk about trauma-informed practice. This is also a very individualistic view of trauma. So let's think about that. A lot of the ways that people orient around trauma is thinking about, oh, thank you, Christy. Yes. The acronym for SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It's the part of the government that funds and supports a lot of work around substance substance abuse and mental health services. When we think about trauma and we think about an individual experiencing trauma, we could think about an acute event, something that happens just once, or chronic stress. And it's important to say there are times that happen, like right now, where someone might experience both. They might have something acute happen, and they might also be navigating some chronic stress. And during COVID, I think our definitions and understanding about the impact of acute and chronic stress has all broadened because we have all experienced it in a new way. And then there were fires, and then there was an ice storm. Like, there are many ways in which we are understanding our own trauma response right now in real time. But these are still very individualistic ways that we're thinking about trauma. And another way that's very important to think about trauma is to think about community trauma. That's about intergenerational poverty. It's about consistent long-term unemployment or chronic disinvestment. It's about environments that have not had an investment and are deteriorating. It's about navigating public spaces that might be dangerous, and about having disconnected or damaged social relationships, social networks, social communities that are also very important protective factors when they're intact. So the way that we think about trauma, some of the newer work on trauma has a broader view of trauma than just the narrow individualistic view of trauma, but really thinks about it much broader. And I'm going to continue to talk about this in a couple slides. If you are looking at an individual and seeing somebody who's experiencing trauma response, you might see a lot of different things. You might see difficulty focusing. You might see difficulty recalling things. You might see somebody who is absent a lot. You might see some more challenges in emotional regulation. You might see somebody who plays it calm and has a fear of taking risks and has a fear of kind of putting themselves out there. You might see an anxiety response. You might see anger. You might see helplessness. There might be many ways in which you see a trauma response play out. This slide has a lot to it, and I know, and I apologize, but what I wanted to make a point of here is that there's a lot that constitutes trauma, and how someone experiences trauma is based on themselves and their own experiences. And in the literature, there is half of these that are on the slide that are called out specifically as an adverse childhood experience. That adverse childhood experience can be shortened to use the acronym ACE. And there's a lot of interesting research on ACE scores. The ACE study was done in I think it was the 1980s. Gosh, I can't remember. But it was done in San Diego by the Kaiser Permanente system. There were 2 lead investigators. I've met them. They're wonderful humans. They created this study where they thought, gosh, I wonder what the impact of experiencing trauma was. And they just picked 10 out. There is nothing magical about the 10 that they picked. It was 2 guys coming up with a list. They emailed everybody who was a Kaiser member, and they said, hey, do you have any of these? What the ACE list does is helps us understand the prevalency of trauma, that there are reasons just to know about it and there are reasons to not use it. So I want to spend a moment unpacking this, because as you further your learning and in trauma, this is something you're going to see more of as a part of, the literature. So the ACEs are only some types of trauma, as you saw in that last slide. But what in understanding the prevalence of ACEs in the classroom, we can understand just how many people experience trauma and help understand really the prevalence that when you are educators working with a group of students, it is likely that there is a portion of the kids in your group who will have a very few number of traumatic experiences, but it is also just as likely that you will be working with a large number of students that have some very significant ACE scores. And that, of course, is just looking at a portion of what constitutes trauma. So one of the key things that as you are orienting towards a trauma-informed perspective, it's essential for you to recognize that there is a high prevalence of trauma in our communities, in our lives, and our friend groups, that this is a reality that we are navigating. This is another slide to make the same point. I don't have to belabor it, but this is an example. The data is from 2014 about some statistics about adversity in our state and young people who reported different types of adversity. One other really essential understanding that is important when we're understanding trauma is that trauma is not just about the brain, but trauma is also held within the body. And there's a great book about this if you'd like to learn more by Bessel van der Kolk, that's The Body Holds the Score, that is about the way in which your body holds memories. And I think this slide has a nice, really brief overview about the fact that there are certain things that are in our perception, but there are certain ways that our bodies are also learning while there might be a traumatic experience. If we go back to what we just talked about with the Dan Siegel view of brain development, this is about talking about some of those implicit and explicit memories. The implicit are the nonverbal memories. They're very much a part of the way that we experience trauma. And so as we learn more and as our understanding of trauma responses deepen, it's important to realize there are physiological ways that our bodies experience trauma as well, that are a component of a trauma-informed practice, addressing those and thinking about them. Finally, I wanted to make note of epigenetics, not because I'm an expert in it, but because it's fascinating and there's so much there to learn and there's new information all the time. If you're interested in learning more about epigenetics, you know, when we were taking science, we learned about genetics and we learned about the ways that DNA make us who we are and that we look like our mom or our dad, and we have this examples. We kind of learned about this first view about human development. Really, epigenetics is on a cutting edge of science and talks about how there are markers that happen that transform how your DNA is turned off and turned on. Epigenetics is really fascinating because it helps us understand things in a totally different way. And what some of the examples that scientists are doing are experiencing or having, like, mice experience some very significant forms of trauma, and then seeing a trauma response occur not just in the mouse that experienced the trauma, but in that mouse's grandchildren. So we know that there are different ways that our bodies are holding memories and that we are learning to unpack. There was just a Hidden Brain podcast about epigenetics that could be a nice resource for you to learn about. But one of my favorites is there is a researcher at Harvard called Rachel Yehuda. I think it's Yehuda. And she did a podcast with On Being with Krista Tippett about epigenetics several years ago that I listened to several times, and every time I learn new things on. So this is a way in which we will learn and talk about trauma and trauma responses different in the future, and that we really are only beginning to understand. Finally, when we are exploring what trauma means, I wanted to mention something that I like. There's a term called post-traumatic growth, but there's been we have a deep and growing understanding of resilience and what protective factors are and the science of resilience. But I think it's important when we're beginning to explore trauma and understand how trauma impacts us, for us to not just think about the negative aspects of trauma and the negative aspects of what a stressed out system can do, but also paint a more full picture about the post traumatic growth that can happen. And so I want to read this out loud to you, just to cement an idea that might be something that is worth exploring as well. The research suggests that between 30 to 70% of individuals who experience trauma also report a positive change in growth coming out of that traumatic experience. Post-traumatic growth is defined as an experience of individuals whose development, at least in some areas, has surpassed what was present before the struggle or the crisis occurred. The individual not only survived, but has experienced changes that are viewed as important and that are beyond the status quo. Individuals have described profound changes in their view of relationships, how they view themselves, and their philosophy on life. So, working with folks that have experienced post-traumatic stress and then post-traumatic growth, like there are some incredible wisdoms and lessons learned that our colleagues can share with us and that we can learn from by experiencing not only the negative aspects of trauma, but also learning about post-traumatic growth. And again, there's a lot more here on post-traumatic growth if you're interested in learning about it, both how it can be supported through therapeutic relationships and how it also can happen naturally as well. So I just shared several different ways in which to think about trauma and to understand trauma. I'd like to say that our goal is to understand trauma so that we understand it's real, it's highly impactful, and it's highly prevalent, but to not center ourselves on trying to understand all the different aspects of trauma. So I want to pause. I want to ask what questions you have, and then let's move to talking about a trauma-informed response. Are there any questions? What research has been done on COVID-related trauma? Thank you for asking that. It's a great question. I just have to say, what we learn from research takes so long. One of my favorite researchers said, listen, it takes up to 17 years for someone to get an idea, fund an idea, conduct a study, set the study up, analyze the data, and publish the results. So I'm sure there will be a lot of really interesting lessons learned on COVID-related trauma, but I think we're many years, frankly, from really understanding that and applying it. And this is where I work for a research organization and at the same time have a healthy skepticism about what we can and can't know from research. And just, I think there'll be things that we can learn in the future. Is trauma more prevalent in the past or less? I don't, um, Daniel, that's an interesting question. I don't know that that's what I don't know that it's possible to answer something like that, just in the there are times in, the human, how should I say this? There are times of war and conflict where there is extreme trauma for lots of folks. There are institutions that have been created in the past and that continue to play out in the future, that are very traumatic. And so I think that how you navigate trauma has to do too with who you are, what your identity is, how you're positioned. And it could be different for different people. Um, Okay, we only have about 15 minutes and we still need to talk about a trauma-informed response. So let's continue. Okay, so a question that we've got added a different way, but I'm going to ask it again, is how do you know that someone has experienced trauma? How do you know when someone's experienced it? Maybe you do, but in all honesty, you don't. No one does. And maybe as an educator, it might be clear, but seeking to ask questions about trauma can be re-traumatizing. And much of what having a trauma-informed perspective is understanding trauma is out there, trauma is prevalent, and that it's not something that we need to do to unpack exactly what is happening. Dan Siegel offers that when you see a young person who has a big response, it's great to stop and say, are you hungry? Are you angry? Are you lonely? Are you tired? Let's start with the basics. But in addition, a strategy that is really the trauma-informed strategy, the way that we think about, when we see something big happen at some sort of coping mechanism or some sort of dysregulation, is to think about what our environment are. How are we setting up an environment where young people can succeed? So really the whole field of trauma-informed practice is about creating a safe, inclusive culture. And that it's important to not try to save a particular student or to get down into the clinical aspects of what trauma looks like and what they're experiencing. But it's important that we try to be effective on thinking, is the environment that we create safe enough for all learners who enter our domain? What is safe about the environment that you're creating? Is it safe enough for all students? Is it only safe for some students? How can you focus on the culture that you're creating so that you know that regardless of what histories young people are bringing with them, that you are creating a place that's safe enough for all who enter your domain? So that brings us to trauma-informed practice and healing-centered engagement. So what is trauma-informed practice? This is a definition from Trauma-Informed Oregon. It's something that they adjusted based on the SAMHSA definition. A trauma-informed approach invites people to realize the impact of trauma and its paths to recovery, to recognize the signs and symptoms that are out there, to respond with this knowledge in policies, procedures, and practices that help mitigate what's going on and really resist re-traumatization. So that is what we're going to focus on for the next 2 trainings. Trauma-informed practice is not about doing something to someone else. Trauma-informed practice is really about shifting your perspective, shifting your response, shifting the way in which you think, you judge, you interact, and how you create an environment for young people to participate and to engage in. A trauma-informed perspective differs from a traditional perspective. And I really like this slide that was created by American Institutes of Research in 2016. The traditional view of trauma-informed the traditional perspective of students when you see some challenging behaviors is that that young person has some deficits and what they're doing is intentional and your job is to fix them, and that you as the adult have the authority and the control, and that you can use punitive types of discipline. And if somebody has some really severe trauma, then they should go to a counselor. So this is what we all know and this is what we experience. And a trauma-informed perspective says challenging behavior is about trauma response. It's about coping with trauma. It's automatic and it's related to stress. And what your job is in the environment is as the adult is to focus on changing the environment. You can offer flexibility and choice, and you can have positive reinforcement to support young people, and that everyone, all staff, everyone on your team shares the responsibility in creating an environment that doesn't re-traumatize students, and that really supports students that are experiencing trauma. Everyone likes to know, well, how is it that what's trauma informed? What should I do? What should I do if a young person does one thing? What do I do if a young person does another thing? And that's a natural way for us to try to understand, what does trauma-informed practice mean? The challenge with that is that each of us are about to go navigate 100 different scenarios. And in each one of those scenarios, there's going to be different contexts. There's going to be different people. There are going to be different ways in which each of those people have different experiences. And that this is not something where you just check off the list. This is really the art of transforming our practice to be better focused on young people and create a culture where they can engage in. So rather than treat trauma-informed practice as something that you just do, having a framework can help us really understand the key principles with which we should be acting. So instead of saying you be trauma-informed in this particular way, some guiding principles of trauma-informed practice are really helpful to say, well, if I'm being trauma-informed, then I'm thinking about safety. I'm thinking about physical safety and psychological safety. Is your response one that is thinking about safety? Some other aspects are around trustworthiness and transparency, about peer support and mutual self-help, collaboration and empathy, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. So this document, I apologize, it's a little hard to read, but this comes from Trauma Informed Oregon. And I think it's a really powerful tool when we're thinking about how do you interact in a trauma-informed way. Trauma Informed Oregon gets a bunch of phone calls. Hey, should I let kids wear hats? Is that trauma informed? I don't know, is it? Let's look at this, let's think about it. It's contextual, it's not that easy. Let's try to understand where there is trauma, what in the environment could be triggering the trauma, and let's mitigate the traumatic experiences. For example, one conversation that I have, or one example, might be if you know that kids have a trauma response when they eat. And maybe there is something there where the young people see something and it causes some trauma, and then the lunch staff might feel like, I can't handle this. A trauma-informed practice helps say, okay, there's something in that environment that is triggering. How do we mitigate that? What could we do to transform the environment? Surprises can be really hard on people. How can we help include empowerment, voice, and choice? How can we help people better understand what's going on so that what's going on in that current environment isn't triggering? This I'll get in more in our last training, but I just really like different tools that help us understand as practitioners that at the very beginning of this journey, we are trauma aware. It's our job to think about trauma. We become more sensitive to it, and then we become better at being responsive and finally informed. So, this is a journey we're all about to take and are at different places on, and that we can help each other be more trauma informed. And finally, when we think about trauma informed practice, I really love this framework that's called the Racing Aces. And basically, this group that does some really nice work on trauma informed practice just calls out in this diagram and in their work, if the work that you're doing is not racially just, it's not trauma informed. So when you're on your own journey to think about improving trauma-informed practice within your communities, if the way in which brown and Black bodies experience trauma is very, very, very important. And you can't do trauma-informed work without really doing significant work on your own program with a critical pedagogy on understanding different types of oppression, different types of experiences that young people have, and really helping to center and to promote that sense of belonging for all people. And so how we do this is something that we need to, in many ways, co-create to create better environments where young people feel like they can be heard, they can be seen, and that are not traumatizing to them. There's a really nice resource that I want to end with that to me is one of my areas of growth that I'm thinking like a learning edge. There's a gentleman named Sean Ginwright who works, gosh, maybe the University of San Francisco. And he's an advocate for trauma-informed practice and does trainings on it. But he also said, and I'm going to read this excerpt to you, while trauma-informed cares offers an important lens to help young people who've been harmed and emotionally injured, it also has limitations. I first became aware of the limitations when trauma-informed care when I was running a healing circle with a young group of African American men. All of them had experienced some form of trauma. During one of our sessions, I explained the impact of stress and trauma on brain development and how trauma can influence emotional health. As I was explaining, one of the young men in the group named Marcus abruptly stopped me and he said, "I am more than what happened to me. I am not just my trauma." I was puzzled at first, but it didn't take long for me to really contemplate what he was saying. The term trauma-informed care didn't encompass the totality of his experience and focused on his harm, injury, and trauma. For Marcus, the term trauma-informed care was akin to saying, "You were the worst thing that ever happened to you." For me, I realized that the term slipped into the murky water of deficit-based, rather than using asset-driven strategies to support our young people and how they've been harmed. Without careful consideration of the terms we use, we can create blind spots in our efforts to support young people. So again, as we're thinking about what we're doing, trauma-informed practice offers a really powerful lens and has limitations. So I invite you to join me in thinking about this. There's really important lessons to be learned, and there are ways that we can also challenge trauma-informed practice at the same time. This article says that instead of just thinking about the what's wrong with you or moving to the what happened to you to have a more trauma-informed view, that we should also center what's right with you and really think about our work in creating healing-centered spaces with young people. And if you'd like to learn more, this is another resource that we can send out. So I want to take a moment, and I see we're already at 11:57. So this last reflection, I'm actually going to ask if you do after we stop recording and after the training is over, but I'd like you to think about in today's training, what will stick with you? What do you want to learn more about? What are reminders that you need to carry forward for yourself that were ahas, that are just important as you promote your own growth and you build your own practice? What are your lessons learned? So we will do this in our next two trainings. I'm going to ask you, as we are on this journey of thinking about our own practice, for you to think about what you'd like to stop doing, continue doing, and start doing because of the information that you share. Here's my email. Feel free to reach me. And Christy, do you want to share right now information about the wrapping up?
Yeah, thank you so much, Celeste. This was super informative, and I'm so excited to find all the resources that you mentioned and get that list going for everyone. So today I will send you an email that has a short survey about the training and also has information if you are planning to request a stipend, a substitute reimbursement, or professional development units for joining this training. There will be information in the email about how to do that. Also a link for registering for upcoming events, including the next two sessions in this series. So we really encourage you to join us again in 2 weeks for the next session in this Trauma-Informed Care at Outdoor School series. And then I'll also give you a link of the website where we're going to post the recording of the training and all of the resources and the slides as well. And we anticipate having all of that ready to go in about 48 hours. So the things in the first two bullets are going to come out today. And then all that information, the resources that I've been keeping tabs of throughout this training, as well as the recording, you should have access to by Thursday. So that's what I have administratively. And Celeste, I'd like to thank you again so much and leave it to you to give a final closing.
Thank you. I know it's at 12 and I want to respect your time. So I think for a close, what I'm going to do is just put these reflection questions back up on the screen and invite you to think about your key points, what stands out for you, and what's important for your own practice to carry forward. Thank you for spending these last 2 hours with me. And again, I look forward to spending time with you in 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone.